That was one of my first lessons in how do you customize your leadership depending on the person that's in front of you? Because even though I was operating the same way with everyone on my team, I came across differently. On the other side of me
Yes.
was a different person with a different style of interactions. And so I had to take that and apply it. And that question stands out for me, the question of what's it like to be on the other side of you? Because there's a difference between this was my intention
Yes.
and this is the impact. My intention was saying hello to everyone in the morning and getting straight to work and being very focused and being able to give feedback on deliverables. But the impact was that not everybody felt seen in that way. And so I had to pivot and take that feedback. Oftentimes, you have a choice when you receive feedback. You can say, well, that was wrong. That's their perception. That's not reality. But I tell people often perception is reality. Even if that's
Yes.
not yours, it's
Yes.
theirs. And understanding that it's going to be different for the people that you lead and taking time to consider what is it like to be on the other side of me and what can I change in order to be most effective with the team in front of me now.
Welcome to Manager, a podcast about the experiences of people leaders and how we can enable them to lead engaged, healthy, and high-performing teams. I'm Kamaria Scott, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us as we learn, lead, and succeed together. Welcome back, friends, to the second episode in this special series that we are doing featuring Acklen Avenue. As you may have heard from the last episode, we are interviewing not one, not two, but three people leaders from this organization and then people who report to them. So you get a full sense of what it's like when an organization has a culture of excellent people leaders. One of the things you're going to hear is that it's not necessarily that they all do everything the same way. It's not cookie cutter at all. It's what I like to call unity with variety. So you'll continue to hear how they lead. You'll continue to hear their individual best practices. But as you listen across the episodes, hopefully you'll also hear the common themes of them being in alignment and some of the essence of leadership that they bring to how they approach leading their teams. So today I am super excited to welcome Chelsea Gonzalez to the episode. She is the impetus behind this wonderful series that you are listening to. Today we're going to get to learn a little bit more about her, how she approaches leadership, and what's it like to be in alignment with people who might lead differently than you. So Chelsea, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. So excited to be here. This is such a great opportunity to talk a little bit more about leadership and what we do here at Acklen, but even more so how this applies to leadership for people in all industries, in all walks of life. So excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you. I did do a little bit of a teaser of how this episode and how this series came about. And before we talk a little bit more about that, I'd love to hear a little bit more about you, your journey through people leadership, and your role at Acklen Avenue.
Yeah. So I did not start out in human resources. I actually was a teacher for 4 years, and I think that educational background is the foundation for how I have chosen to lead my teams and just how I lead myself amongst my peers at any organization that I've been a part of. I was a middle school and high school teacher, and I moved into HR. An opportunity came about. And I started in training and development. I was able to observe different leadership styles and learn from that. And I kind of cherry picked different things that stuck out to me that I thought were true to who I am as a person. And then things that I thought, well, I don't want to apply that in my leadership style when I have
We'll
the
leave that.
opportunity. Yeah. I eventually grew into a manager role and was leading at that time a team of up to 5 people. And now in my new role as the VP of HR at Acklen, I lead a smaller team, but my scope is much larger, broader with the impact across the organization from a senior leadership perspective. It's great to be able to just have a variety of experiences, especially because I think leadership is always evolving, right? With the experiences that you have, the different team members that you lead. I've experienced that my leadership has transformed over time. And I'm excited to see what it'll be like in the next few years too.
As two people who have training and development backgrounds, I think one of the most interesting things is that we try to develop people in advance for the role of becoming someone who leads a team. But I always say it's a full contact sport. You don't really understand it or appreciate it until you get into the game.
Yeah,
And then
for sure.
experience by experience, you're like, okay, I'll do more of that. I'll do less of that. I have to tell you, you made my day. I remember logging into my LinkedIn as I do every morning, and I saw a note from you about this very podcast about manager to manager. Why did the focus on people leadership really stand out to you so much that you wanted to chat about it?
Yeah, so I'm an avid podcast listener because these days with two littles at home, I'm not able to spend as much time reading. And so a lot of my own personal and professional development is through podcasts. And so I came across your podcast, and what stood out is the manager to manager perspective. I think some of the professional development that I do, they focus a lot on leadership at a much higher level. But I think managers are key to impacting culture across the company. And so a lot of your episodes focus on very tactical strategies for leading people and things that we often take for granted, like, oh, I'm not going to spend too much time on that because it doesn't make a huge difference. But actually, it's those daily habits of how you lead people, how you have conversations that build great teams. And so I appreciated coming across your podcast because I think those conversations are key for
Yeah.
growing leaders at the manager level so that when they get to the director and executive level, they already have a solid foundation for leading people.
As listeners, I want you to know I did not pay her to say that. That's exactly right. There's a passion that I have for people leading. And as we talked about, once you sort of think about becoming a people leader, it's a lot of blocking and tackling. It's a lot of day to day. What do I do? How do I handle this? And so I definitely wanted this to be a resource for people leaders who might encounter some of the situations and give them maybe 30 minutes of how do you maybe handle this when it arises. So let's talk about you a little bit more because one of the things that you said was as you encountered change of culture and change of role, you came across people that you were like, okay, I'll take some of this, or maybe I won't take some of that. And that start to shape your own view of what kind of people leader you want to be. So, what things from your early career have started to cement themselves for you as a people leader?
One key thing has been how much time you spend individually with your team members that report up to you directly and how much time you spend together as a whole team. Oftentimes, we default to if there's something wrong, my team member will come to me and let me know, and then I'll handle it after the fact, very reactive. And so, something that stood out to me was how do I make it a routine that I meet with my direct reports every week, and as a whole team, we're meeting regularly so that we can have these conversations. If there's nothing wrong, that's great. It gives us that space to talk about what's going right, affirming what we're doing well as a team and what they're doing well in their individual roles. I also think feedback is another thing that managers usually consider to be like a nice to have, right?
Right.
We give feedback when something's wrong, like, oh, we should have done this differently. But I think that being very intentional about how we deliver that feedback, learning from other managers that I had observed give feedback in the moment very harshly, not very well thought
Yes.
out, not very concrete, very reactive in the sense that there was an emotional response and we're giving feedback in that moment. And I knew that I didn't want to be that leader. If I was going to give feedback, I wanted it to be something specific and concrete so
Yeah.
that I could give a solution or recommendations. And at the end of the day, people can take it. But being as objective as possible because ultimately I see my role as a leader more so as a coach. The way that I measure whether my leadership is successful is if my team is growing. And I tell them often, you can stay or you can leave. Like, I want you to
Yes.
be successful wherever you go. And that's a sign of growth. I think oftentimes as leaders, we're worried that our team members will leave, will outgrow us. But I think that's an indicator that we're doing something right. If they're able to take on that new role,
Yes.
if it's within our organization or if it's somewhere else, approaching my team in that way is something that I've been very intentional
Yeah.
about.
You've said a couple of things that I want to unpack because I want to make sure people don't miss them. The first thing that you said that I really love is you are intentional about the consistency of meeting with people and talking with people, and not just when you have something critical or maybe some constructive feedback to give. And I remember earlier in my career, one of the roles that I had was as a performance consultant. One of our business units brought me in because they were finding that they were having a challenge with people leaders giving good feedback, giving really critical feedback. And so I went and did some sleuthing. I did some I Spy Private Eyeing, as I like to call it. And what I found was they won't have any conversations. They weren't having any conversations at all. And so I said to them, if they're not having any conversations, they're absolutely not going to start with the hard ones.
Hmm.
And so, like, even as a people leader, that practice and habit of talking to people and building rapport, it makes it so much easier when you do have to say, hey, I need to pull you aside and I need to tell you something. If you've spent that time building the relationship before you have to go in and say, hey, you didn't build my widget correctly. Is that something that that resonates with you, or is that what you found to be your experience as well?
100% agree. When you build trust over time, then that person knows that when you do give feedback, the goal is to help them. One thing that stands out, the distinction is not to call people out, but to call people up. And that's
Mm.
how I approach those conversations is that, and I lead with that. My goal is not to trigger a shame response. It's my goal is to say, here's where I've seen you operate. I've seen you perform at this level. Here's what I know what you're capable of. And how do we get there? What was the barrier that kept us from meeting that
Oh, I love
level
that.
of expectations? And when you approach it that way, people are more responsive because oftentimes when we're receiving constructive feedback, if we have a tendency to have that defense mechanism, right? Like, oh no, that wasn't me. But when you approach it from the perspective of my leader knows that I'm capable of this and I am capable of that. I know that. So what
Mhm.
do I do now to make sure that I meet that again in the future?
I really love the notion of calling people up. I don't think I've ever heard anybody describe it that way. And it combines something else I know you and I talked about, which is in order to have that conversation, you have to know what up looks like.
Hmm.
And that's one of the things that when I'm talking with people, I'm always like, do you know what good or do you know what their best day looks like? So if I see Chelsea on her best day, as a people leader, have I observed her enough? Have I interacted with her enough to be able to say, my goodness, I know that when you're at your best, you are creative, you are engaging stakeholders, you are giving me just high quality work. And maybe I'm seeing something that's not quite there yet. So let's have a conversation because I want you to have your best day. But that requires us to even know. And I sometimes challenge my people leaders to say, describe for me what someone looks like on their best day. And that helps me understand how well and how much time they've spent really getting to know their teams.
I love that. Yeah. And again, that's just another reason for spending that time together often and observing them in different spaces, right? Like at Acklen, we call them L10s where we're meeting within our departments, but there's also interdepartmental L10s meetings and observing your team members and how they navigate those conversations. I take the approach of instead of speaking on behalf of my team, I want to see how they speak on behalf of themselves
Mhm.
and having those tough conversations and coming in to support them when needed. But it's so interesting to see, especially as they're talking, maybe they might not be at the same level. They're speaking to a director or a senior leader, but you handle yourself the same. And so for me, it's like observing them and knowing, yeah, they're operating at their best. And on their off days, having that one-on-one conversation to say, I noticed this. And that's another thing I'd like to point out is leading by asking questions, right?
Mhm.
Understanding what was the context, the reason for it, asking as many questions as possible helps people. It's a more collaborative discussion when giving feedback, right? It's not
Yeah.
one-sided where the manager is saying, I noticed this was wrong, XYZ, here's what you need to implement. Instead, approaching it with questions to understand and making that person a part of that discussion, I
I
think is
love
much more
that.
productive.
This is one of the places where you all are unified but different. You, Stephanie, Jennifer, all of you lead with this wonderful approach of curiosity and intentionality. You all are really good about thinking about how you ask questions of people and invite them into the conversation and understand their thought processes and use that to coach people and help them think about how do they get to that destination. So I love that that's one place where you ladies are actually quite aligned and it comes through very loudly that it's one of the values of your organization. One thing that you said during our prep call is that you're always very intentional about how something lands. There's this awareness of what it's like to be on the other side of you. Because people leaders, it floats into our thought process, but I don't know it's always at the front. So, what can you share about that and how you approach that?
So when I was early in my career as a manager, I was learning on the go. And one of my team members, they left the company, and in their exit interview, some of the feedback that they had was that my manager, which was me at the time, can come across unapproachable, like doesn't ask me in the morning, like specific things about my kids, my family. And I was checking in the morning, hey, how are you doing?
Yes.
And having small talk, right? It wasn't until after the fact that I did that self-reflection and recognizing, okay, this person likes for me to ask about XYZ. It's different for everyone. Some people prefer to go straight into talking about a project that they're working on and being very tactical in our discussions, and that's how
Hmm.
they feel seen and valued. And then the people, it's what did you do this weekend and how was last night and those types of conversations. And for me, I'm naturally an introverted person, and I lean into that because I think that's one of my secret weapons. My leadership style is listening and observing. But in this case, when interacting with someone who was very extroverted, who was very people person, I was not meeting the mark there. And I had to recognize that that was one of my first lessons in how do you customize your leadership depending on the person that's in front of you. Because even though I was operating the same way with everyone on my team, I came across differently. On the other side of me
Yes.
was a different person with a different style of interactions. And so I had to take that and apply it. And that question stands out for me, the question of what's it like to be on the other side of you? Because there's a difference between this was my intention
Yes.
and this is the impact. And so my
Mhm.
intention was saying hello to everyone in the morning and getting straight to work and being very focused and being able to give feedback on deliverables. But the impact was that not everybody felt seen in that way. And so I had to pivot and take that feedback. And I think oftentimes you have a choice when you receive feedback. You can say, well, that was wrong. That's their perception. That's not reality. But I tell people often perception is reality. Even if that's
Yes.
not yours, it's
Yes.
theirs. And understanding that it's going to be different for the people that you lead, and taking time to consider what is it like to be on the other side of me and what can I change in order to be most effective with the team in front of me now.
I love that you mentioned intent versus impact. When I see things on LinkedIn, they're like, good managers do this and bad managers do that. It makes me itch. But it's because I don't think that people leaders wake up in the morning and go, who can I terrorize today? How can I come to work and make Chelsea's day awful? I think a lot of times they are like, how do I come to work and how do I get this work done? And somewhere in that thought process, it gets lost of it's not that I have to get work done, but it's how I get the work done and how am I interacting with people and how are they perceiving me. And so I may not show up with the intention of demotivating people or creating an environment where they don't feel seen or valued, but maybe unintentionally that's what I'm doing. I play this game I call Match Me If You Can, and it's where I have people leaders learn about the motivators of people on their teams, and we talk about how do you match that person? How do you first identify what that person needs? Because I'm a people person. I love a good chat. And I had someone on my team that she loves a good chat. But then I also have someone on my team who would be like, I just want to give you my list of things and go about my day. Thank you so much. And there is a need to flex to that. I don't think that people leaders start off intentionally trying to make their teams angry, but sometimes we don't think about what it's like to be on the other side of us.
Yeah, and I think if you have the resources available, one thing that I've used is the Five Voices assessment to understand the different leadership styles or personality types on my team. It doesn't mean that it captures them perfectly. It doesn't put them in a box, but it does help me understand like the five voices. It'll give you an idea of here are their strengths, here are their opportunities for
I
improvement,
like
here
that.
are their triggers. And I used it with my team, and we had conversations about it. Giving people language to make it as objective as possible helps. And so for me as a leader, understanding them at that level helps me be more proactive in how I deliver feedback and how I give positive recognition, right? Affirming people and what they're doing well. One example that I'll use, one of the voices is the nurturer. They're usually the most quiet, but they're people who really take care of those around them. And they're the people you go to know if I'm going to implement this change, how is this going to affect people? How are they going to feel about it? Again, this is not 100% across the board for everybody, but usually they're not expecting you to shout them out in the middle of a meeting. But in a
Right.
one-on-one, they would love for you to say, hey, I noticed that before we rolled this out, you gave this feedback about how this was going to impact morale. I appreciate that. And this is how we made this change. And that is positive recognition, right? That's affirming that they're bringing that perspective into the discussion. What I'm also very intentional about is, like, for me, I am a creative pioneer. And what that essentially means is that in meetings, I'm not the first to speak. I am going to take time to put my thoughts together. And it might take me a few minutes, but I'm going to give feedback. Just give me some time, or give me the agenda ahead of time if you're expecting me to speak early on. Help
Yes.
me spend time so I can process and put together a few ideas. The way that I use that with my team is that I have to be very intentional to tell them I'm thinking out loud. This might not make sense. This doesn't mean
Yes.
we're going to move forward, but I want that space to brainstorm out loud and know that we're in the brainstorm stage. I didn't know to do that in the past. I didn't know that about myself. And I didn't know that people were taking it as truth, like, okay, this is what she's saying. So this is what we're going to do moving forward. Just adding that simple phrase of I'm thinking out loud. This doesn't mean we're going to move forward with it. I just want some space to brainstorm. Helps people, gives permission to people to push back, but also lets them know this doesn't mean this is set in stone. So, a couple of
But
takeaways there.
again, I love the intentionality of that. And not even just the intentionality, but the positional awareness of that. A lot of times when we are positionally the people leader, when you show up into a room, your words have weight and they have gravity. And so it's important for people to know I'm just musing. You're invited to contradict my muse if you'd like, but I'm more so needing to process, and this is what I'm doing for myself. The more that people can see you as a people leader, discussing yourself, saying this is my process, this is what I need, it also opens the door and invites them to then say, this is what I'm doing for myself, and this is what I
Mhm.
need, and here's how I might join the conversation. And then you start to have this shared understanding of one another. I love that you mentioned five voices, but whether you use that, whether you use DISC, whether you use Myers-Briggs, the important part is that in your teams that you do have some common language that helps you identify someone's behaviors, what they might need, so that you all can flex for one another. You are a literally walking example of everything that we would hope people leaders would be. How do you know that's working? When you are looking across your team and you're standing across in the virtual hallway of it all, what do you see happening, or what are you seeing in their behaviors or reactions that gives you then that, like, yes, this is working. This is I'm on the right track. I'm doing the things that are helping my team grow, perform, those types of things.
I think it's a couple of things. Like, do I see growth within them in their own respective roles? Are they growing, understanding more, and taking on higher level responsibilities and able to follow through with that? The other thing is when I'm in a meeting with them, if it's just our team, is it quiet? And if there's a contentious topic up on the agenda that I know we're going to be talking about, do I see some productive discussions and it's not just one-sided? Do I see both team members able to push back on each other and push back on me? Are we asking the right questions is another indicator of, are we open to different styles of work, different personality types? When we're thinking about rolling out initiatives, especially from the HR perspective, it impacts so many people that don't necessarily understand, don't have the context that we have. Are we thinking about all of those components before rolling something out and the impact that it'll have on the organization? And then what are people saying about them to me? So am I getting good feedback about how they're interacting with people even when I'm not in the room, right? Because it's not just can you perform whenever your leader's in the room, it's are you performing and carrying yourself the same way with other division leaders, with other department leaders, because then there's consistency. And I ask often, at least once a month, and during our one-on-one, give me feedback. What's working? What's not working?
Yes.
There's a start, stop, continue model of questioning. I ask often, what's one thing that I'm doing that I should continue to do that helps you, that builds trust with you? What's one thing that I should stop doing? And that question of what do I do that breaks trust with you? Because it's different for every person. And then what should I start doing? By doing that, it opens it up for them to ask those same questions of themselves. Leaders, you set the example. Like being vulnerable, sharing your opportunities for improvement helps create a safe space for your direct reports, for other leaders in the room to feel like it's okay to not be great at everything, to recognize here's
Mhm.
where I'm missing the mark, but here's what I'm going to do to make sure I keep improving. For example, I just met my team in person, and I am a terrible bowler. I learned that I'm terrible at ping pong. I am terrible at like solving mysteries on the spot. And we hadn't experienced each other in that way. And I was very candid in letting them know I'm one of the most competitive people and I have to keep that in check. And so the fact that I'm terrible at all of these things, like I just instantly want to give up, but I'm not going to because here's the fun part about it. And here's where I'm experiencing growth. And so it opened up a great discussion of one of my team members asked, well, knowing that you're competitive and knowing that about this about yourself, how do you approach it with your children? And now we're talking about parenting with team members that
Yeah.
don't have kids. And so I think it's those discussions are indicators to me that we're creating a safe space amongst our team so that there is opportunity for growth.
And one of the things that stands out to me from what you just said too is that there's two things that kind of stand out to me. One is that we do, as people leaders, have to be vulnerable to receiving feedback. And it's hard to hear people tell us, like, you're doing it wrong
Yeah.
or you've missed the mark here. One of the reasons why I started this podcast was to humanize people leaders. I think sometimes when we become people leaders, we're no longer seen as people who might be sensitive, might be terrible bowlers, might be competitive. Like we're just not seen as whole, full people anymore. And so I think sometimes even letting people see that we have faults, we have happy moments, we have sad moments, that builds trust in a relationship with our teams because it's not like we're up here and down there. Yes, there's this different dynamic to the relationship, but I am just like you in a lot of ways and we can find commonality. How do you brace yourself for I have to go in and ask somebody how I'm doing as their leader and they may be like, you're terrible this quarter.
Yeah, on a very basic level, I'm very aware of my physical response to feedback. So as we're going to jump into the Google Meets and I see the talking points, that helps me, but it also can drive anxiety. And this is what I tell my team as well. Like when you feel triggered, when you feel like you have a flight or fight response, notice what's happening within your body because that's going to be the first indicator that something you're feeling defensive. And we all react differently. Some people are more verbal and how they respond. Other people just shut down, and you can notice in their body how their body language is indicating that they're shutting down. For me, like I notice my chest gets warm, my ears get warm, like my face feels flushed. And as soon as I notice this, I have to ask the question, if I ask for feedback, why am I scared to get it now? This isn't an indication that I have failed across the board. It doesn't mean I'm a terrible leader. It means that there's an opportunity for me to improve. Maybe it was one moment that I missed the mark, or maybe I've been missing it this entire quarter. But if I want to continue growing and serving the people that I lead, I need to know what my blind spot is. And when you center yourself on that, yes, it still hurts when you get that constructive feedback of you weren't perfect, but you don't know what you don't know, right? The biggest failure to me is when you don't ask the question and you see that your team's morale is declining or performance is declining because we didn't take that time to ask, where am I not doing right by you? Where can I do better?
I love that. So how do we continue to let people get to know us and let people in so that they do realize that yes, we are people leaders, but we're people. We're people first. So like
Yeah.
how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so I think finding opportunities where it's low stakes, right? Where you can have casual conversations and build trust slowly. I think it's leaders owning where, oh yeah, I missed this mark. I didn't do this correctly, but here's what I am gonna do better. Apologizing to your team. Some might see that as a sign of weakness, that if you apologize, you're admitting that you did something wrong, you're not a good leader. But apologizing builds trust and it shows, hey, I recognize that I messed up here. I didn't know, but now I know I'm going to change. I can't say that I did this early on in my career because I did have that view that leaders have to be perfect because you're setting the example, right?
Yes.
And I think it's not realistic. When I became a parent, it shifted my way of thinking. I realized I'm not going to be perfect. I can't be perfect. And I need to be very transparent with my team. Like, here's my capacity, here's my energy level, and having these very candid conversations about where I am at so that they recognize that that's okay for them to have that same experience, right?
Yes.
And I think about like when my children enter the workplace, what kind of leaders do I want leading them? I want people who are okay with being vulnerable and being a human being. And I want them to be okay with them being human beings as well. I have somebody on my team who she's had the opportunity to observe me at the executive level, like working with our senior leaders in a meeting on a weekly basis. And she said, she's like, it's so interesting. Like you you shift. Like with us, you're more, I can be goofy with them. I can
Yeah.
be, and it's okay. And I tell her, you are going to shift depending on who's in the room. At the end of the day, your values stay the same. And so having even that conversation, it's vulnerable, recognizing that there's some spaces where you're not going to be the goofy person. You're
Right.
going to be the serious person because you're the HR leader in the room. But with your team, it's okay because we're building trust and we're learning from each other and we're human beings at the end of the day.
I love that. I love that response. And I think it's a wonderful segue to the who's in the room piece because part of what makes this series special is that there are several of you as people leaders who are making up the collective leadership culture of Acklen Avenue. And so I don't know if we formally said this at the beginning, but you are the VP of HR for Acklen Avenue, and you are then on the executive team. And so in our last couple of minutes, I want to talk about one of the things that often gets missed when we become managers is the conversation of it's not just how you lead your team, but the effectiveness that you have as a people leader is also based on the relationships you have with your peers and the relationships that you have with your own leader, because you're always cascading down what needs to happen in the organization. And so I want to now go across. We talked about building trust amongst your team that goes down, but having met you, having met Stephanie, having met Jennifer, I'm curious, how do you all go about making sure that as people who need to be in alignment, you have your own level of trust amongst yourselves?
Yeah. So I think for that, you've mentioned that we all have our own leadership styles and personality types. And with that, we lean into a system so that we can keep it as objective as possible. And having that structure helps to guide discussions, especially when they're tense discussions that have a huge impact on people across the organization. So being able to lean into a system and a structure to help make sure that we're keeping the discussion as objective as possible and that what's guiding that discussion is our values as a company and our values as leaders. As far as building trust with my peers and the leaders at the senior leadership level, it's again still having regular meetings with them. And it's okay if there's no problem to solve, but having a meeting with them to build trust for them to know who I am and that consistency of the way that I show up. Stephanie's mentioned this as
Yes.
well. Jen has mentioned this. People continue to trust you when you show up the same way. When you
Mm,
say you're going to do something and you deliver on it, you're accountable. And oftentimes I think because there's so many moving parts, we it can feel like, okay, even if I don't deliver on this, even if I said that I was going to deliver on it, and if I don't, it's okay. It is okay, but recognizing that it can break trust over time. If you
yes.
said you were going to take this feedback, and especially
Yes.
from the HR side, we're getting feedback all the time of this initiative was not the right one, or this is impacting morale, or this
Hmm.
policy needs to change. Having the capacity to hear that constructive feedback and showing where you will then make that change, whether it's a minor change or whether it stays the same, but explaining why it stays the same is showing that you can trust me, that I'm going to hear it and we're going to have a discussion about it because I trust you and I recognize that you have a say in this organization the same way that I do. And so
Yes.
showing up every time authentically is key.
I love that. One of the things that I learned from your prep conversations, and we talked about this, is that you did disrupt HR. And I learned that Stephanie came from Tennessee down to
Hmm.
South Florida to watch your presentation, your 5 minutes of fame. I'm curious, what did that mean to you? Because obviously, here you are, you're very senior yourself, but your own personal people leader still traveled to support you in something that you were doing. How did that make you feel?
Extremely valued. Even for me, I told her, I said, it's only 5 minutes. And like, she's like, I know. And but are you sure? Because it's only 5 minutes and it's this amount of time for that event. She's like, I want to be there. I want to support you. And I think that it just, again, builds trust, but also just that value. Senior leaders are still human beings at the end of the day. I was still nervous. This was my first big speaking event. And at least for me, in my eyes. And so I had talked to her about it even from the beginning and told her I applied to speak because of her leadership, because she motivated me and gives me that positive feedback. And the more we surround ourselves with people who build us up and who support us, you get even more brave. Like you're like, yeah, I could go for this. And so she's been key in my own professional development. And to have her there, it was full circle for me that this is a great place to be. I'm surrounded by great leaders. I report up to an incredible leader and I take notes on her leadership style. One thing that I came into Acklen with at the time, it was a 3-year-old and a 4-month-old. And I was so concerned, like, how am I going to manage this level of responsibility and having 2 kids? And she was completely supportive from the very beginning. She's like, you're not only an incredible professional, you're an incredible mother. And the fact that she recognizes that I am a whole person and not just the VP of HR, I am a mom, I am a wife,
Yes.
and encourages me to take time and prioritize my family. She has those conversations with me regarding her career and how it's developed over time and things that she would have done differently, things that she is happy that she did, helps me as I grow in my career and as a mom. And so she's an incredible leader, and I am so appreciative that she was there. I introduced her to so many people there at the event, and even one of my previous coworkers, she mentioned, she's like, is she real? Like she's so she's authentic. She's so supportive of other women and just builds people up. I was like, she's real. Like that's her. And so
I
she's
love
awesome.
it. I love it. I think that's a wonderful place to end today. It's so important for people to know that even senior leaders need leaders who support them, who encourage them, who help them. I think it's one of the places where I do feel like we have a ways to go once people become managers and middle managers. It's like, unfortunately, we stop seeing them as people who need things from their senior leaders. Listen, this has been the most amazing episode. You've given us so many good things. And so, obviously, on the behalf of the listeners, I want to thank you for giving us your time and sharing your expertise with us. And for the listeners, what I hope you will take away from this episode and really from this series is the importance of leading your team with intentionality, of thinking about what it's like to be on the other side of you and being vulnerable enough to gather that information, to talk with your team about what's working and what's not working and how you all can make it better. And then again, if you're a very senior leader and executive, how can continue to support the people underneath you so they also feel valued and feel like they are able to get what they are expected to give to both their teams and the organization. So, Chelsea, one last question. If people would like to reach out to you, is LinkedIn the best way to do that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And would you mind if I find your Disrupt HR? Can I put that in the show notes?
For sure. I would love that.
I would love everyone to see your 5 minutes of fame. Well, on behalf of the listeners and myself, thank you again. And for those of you, again, listening, please take care of yourself until next time. And thank you for listening to Manager to Manager.